Hi, today we're going to read Chapter 2 of Nothing's Fair in 5th grade. This chapter is called A Sports Car Holds Only Two. Let's begin. At noon the next day, Elsie had her lunchbox cleaned before I even got my hot lunch tray into the classroom. She sat with her hands folded, staring first at Sharon and then at me. Halfway through the lunch period, Mr. Douglas, the principal, walked in. He's a great big joking man. At least he is if you aren't a troublemaker. He walked around the room asking kids how they liked their lunches. When he came to Elsie, he said, "And where's your lunch, young lady?" I ate it. She never really looked at grown-ups but kept her face pointing down. "I hope it was good." He patted her on the shoulder and went on up the aisle. While I licked a smear of frosting from my fingers, I watched Elsie watching the teacher. When Mrs. Hanson bent her head to stir her tea, Elsie leaned back toward Sharon. "Are you going to eat your cake?" "Yes, I am," Sharon answered, pulling her tray closer to her chest. Elsie turned to Mary Ann. "Are you going to eat your cake?" Mary Ann is the littlest girl in the room. She isn't very smart, but she's nice to everyone. "You can have half," Mary Ann said. Elsie took the piece of cake and jammed it into her mouth. Mrs. Hanson was at Elsie's desk in a flash. "Elsie, what are you doing?" Elsie was so surprised, her mouth flopped open with the hunk of chocolate cake hanging on her lower teeth. "Elsie, spit that out into the wastebasket, and don't let me catch you disobeying me again." Mrs. Hanson's voice was so sharp I shivered. Elsie spit the cake into the wastebasket, while we all craned our necks to watch her. When she was back at her desk, she took out her reading book, opened it to the middle, and stared at the pages. Mrs. Hanson and the principal stood at front of the room talking quietly. Then Mr. Douglas went over to Elsie and put his hand on her shoulder again. "Young lady," he said, "you'd better straighten up and start behaving in this school. We won't put up with any of your antics here." I wasn't certain what he meant by antics, but I wondered what Elsie had done in her other school. After that day, the boys started calling Elsie Scrounge, and she was the classroom reject. My mother says I should be nice to everyone. Either school was different when she was young, or she just doesn't remember. I mean, I'm not a mean girl, but I do have best friends. There are girls like Mary Ann who will play with anyone, and everyone still likes them. There's nothing to hate about Mary Ann. She's little and friendly, and she will lend you anything. My mother says Mary Ann has character. I told my mother Mary Ann works all day and only gets C's. Mother said grades aren't everything. She says things like that, but when I bring home my report card, I better have only A's and B's. So Mary Ann talked to Elsie, but nobody else went near her. Elsie kept standing by the school wall at recess. She hardly moved unless she saw some kid who had sneaked candy out on the playground. Then she walked up and asked for a piece. She couldn't scrounge at lunchtime because Mrs. Hanson watched her like a hawk. Mrs. Hanson didn't pick on kids for no reason, but she could hang right onto you if you were doing something bad. The only one she had trouble catching was Jack. Most of the time, he was just too sneaky for her. One day, when Elsie had been in our room a few weeks, Mrs. Hanson said she would work in groups for globe study. There were 7 world globes, so that meant 4 students would share each globe. Mrs. Hanson called on Mary Ann to choose the first group. Mary Ann chose me and Diane. Next, she should have chosen Sharon because we're friends, but she didn't. She chose Elsie. I opened my mouth to object, but closed it as fast as I saw Mrs. Hanson eyeing me. One group sat on the floor by the teacher's desk. The ditto worksheets listed the latitude and the longitude of 6 cities. We were supposed to find the cities on the globe and write down their names. Diane was the smartest in social studies, so she found most of the cities, and we finished before any of the other groups. I told Diane what happened on Mork and Mindy the night before, because her TV was broken. To be polite, Mary Ann asked Elsie what movies she'd seen lately. Elsie said her little sister and her mother had seen a show over the weekend, but she didn't go. How come you didn't go? Diane asked. Mama has a sports car, and it only holds 2, Elsie said. Then you get to go next time, Mary Ann said. I don't think so. Elsie shook her head slowly. Why not? Diane asked. Well, Mama says I'm big enough to stay home alone, and my little sister isn't, Elsie explained. That's dumb, Diane said. Why doesn't she get a babysitter for your little sister? She does sometimes, but not to take me. Why not? Diane persisted. I don't think she wants anyone to know that I belong to her. I'm too fat, I guess. I watched Elsie separate a yellow curl from the rest of her hair, twirl it around a thick finger, and yank on it. I guess Mary Ann saw this too, because she suddenly asked me how my kitten was doing. I told her she had a sleeping box on the back porch. She had to stay outside all the time except when I was playing with her. I bet Mama would like to do that with me, Elsie said. I told my mother about Elsie and her mother. Mother said, poor little thing. I said, Mother, she's no little thing.